Good morning, everyone, and welcome to IHR Australia's third webinar in a series on decoding psychosocial risk in the workplace. My name is Nicole Wallace, and I'm a proud member of the team here at IHR Australia. We'd like to thank you for taking time out of your morning to join us this morning. We have a very, very relevant topic to today's workplace, and that topic is addressing the impact of poor support on remote and isolated workers. And we look forward to a robust discussion and really hope that you get some key takeaways this morning from our discussion. Now, we have a poll and we love audience participation. So I would encourage, if possible, for you to take our poll. Today's poll is: have you implemented any of the below employee benefits to support remote workers' physical and mental well-being? So please have a look and participate. And on that note, if you have any questions while you're listening to today's webinar, pop them down in the chat and we will endeavour to answer as many as we can at the end of the session. Now, for some housekeeping announcements, everybody that registered today will receive a link, an email link over the next few days. And in that email, there'll be a link to today's recording and a transcript. So keep an eye out for the email. Now, without further ado, I would love to introduce our host for today. We have our Managing Director at IHR Australia, Stephen Bell, and our Consulting Psychologist, Stephen Booker. Good morning, Stevens.
And a very good morning to you, Nicole, and thank you very, very much for that wonderful introduction.
Yeah,
and good morning to you, Steve.
Good morning to you, Nicole and Steve. Looking forward to our third webinar on this important topic.
It's a very important topic, and I've been really looking forward to it because I've got some very strong personal views myself on remote and isolated employees and the challenges that they face. I won't share all of them with you today, but I'm looking forward to dissecting some of the really important factors in ensuring that people that are in isolated or remote work situations are being provided with the appropriate level of support. But I can't help thinking, and the first thing that comes to my mind when it comes to remote working, of course, is people working at home. And I've been thinking recently, because I hear story after story of the amount of young people who are starting jobs, and they're starting jobs working from home. And what an interesting situation that is in relation to aspects such as mentoring, coaching, and getting used to doing the role. But that's something that we can cover a little bit further down the road today. So, Steve, what would be a really good place to start would be our agenda for the day.
Absolutely. We're looking today at covering the definition that the safety regulators have of poor support for remote and isolated workers. We want to try and talk a little bit about what industries or occupations have the highest prevalence, although I'll foreshadow that's actually not as easy to get data on that as it has been for our two prior psychosocial risks. There's great data about proportion of people working from home, but it's a bit harder for Australian data on isolated or remote work. I've got some views though. We do want to definitely talk about how a lack of support for remote and isolated workers could potentially impact physical and mental well-being. Definitely want to spend some time talking about the interventions that employers can use to increase support for this category of workers. And as always, talk a little bit about the return on investment of those interventions and answer some of our questions. And I'll stop the screen share there, but I just want to make 3 quick points, Steve, at the opening of our presentation. And the first is the safety regulators always emphasize the need for employers not to think about psychosocial risks in isolation, and that certain risks can combine to create harm. And this is a classic example because the harms that may occur from remote or isolated work, you don't always get harm from those types of work, but the harms that may occur definitely are exacerbated when that is combined with a lack of good support. So this is a classic example of how harms may combine. The flip side of the coin is that good support can reduce or buffer some of the harms that can occur from remote or isolated work. The second thing I'd like to say
Can
is,
I just sort of say, and one of the things that comes to mind straight away for me is excessive workload and working in an isolated situation. That to me is feedback that I get from a lot of our wonderful participants.
yeah, 100%. And there is evidence that one of the potential risks of working from home, whether that's full-time or hybrid, is it makes it more difficult for people to control the work hours, or that they might be working excessive work hours.
Yeah.
So that's unsurprising that you hear that feedback.
Yeah.
Second point I wanted to make real quick is I will definitely today summarize what the research says about the potential impacts of working from home. And by that, I mean both full-time work from home, but also hybrid models on well-being and productivity. But my focus today is on how remote work, including working from home, can create psychosocial risks and how employers can manage those risks. I'm not really going to wade into the political, ethical debate about should employers be requiring employees to come back into the office. My third point, real quick, is I think hybrid work patterns are here to stay. Employers are winding back the level of work from home, but at least some level of hybrid work is here to stay for many, many people. And I just think it's a critical skill for leaders to be thinking through how I'm managing hybrid and remote teams. Back to you, Steve.
But of course, as we move on to talking about the definition of remote or isolated work, of course, it's a lot more than just working from home. And so if you could provide us with the definition, because I think it's very illuminating.
So we're really talking about three different categories of work here, I think, when we talk about remote or isolated work. Prior to this really big working from home experiment that COVID forced on many of us, not all of us, of course, remote work and isolated work was not so prevalent. And remote or isolated work could be work that is in a remote environment. So we might have people working out in the field, but it can also be in the cities where we're just isolated from other colleagues. So we could have, for example, sales representatives or real estate agents who are traveling around but working in an isolated situation, not necessarily isolated from everybody, but just isolated from supervisors and co-workers who can provide support. Other examples might be truck drivers, train drivers, pilots, scientists, or park rangers working in remote areas, fly-in, fly-out workers, or offshore oil rig workers. And remote or isolated work is defined as, difficulty or long delays in getting emergency or medical help due to either the location or the time or the nature of the work. It could include poor access to reliable communication technology, long commutes to work sites, limited access to recreation or opportunities to escape work, and reduced access to support networks and a lower capacity to meet family commitments. And finally, just trying to define poor support. And we'll see that that is also defined very broadly. I think a lot of people, when they hear the psychosocial risk of poor support, naturally think it's about leadership and supervision. That is certainly a component of it, but it absolutely also includes a lack of support from peers and colleagues. It includes cultures that are very highly competitive or insecure or critical and uncooperative, and therefore don't reward or encourage colleagues to support each other. It can include physical workspaces where it's hard for people to, leaders or others to support each other. For example, there's a lack of suitable spaces to discuss sensitive issues, or workers are physically separated. And finally, it can definitely include a lack of or poorly maintained or frequent competition for the tools, the systems, the equipment, or the resources needed to do the job. So it is a lot broader than just the actions of supervisors and leaders.
Absolutely. And I just find it so interesting because we never really think that ultimately a truck driver who's doing long haul is isolated and they actually need certain strategies and tactics to provide them with the support that they need. Because, you know, I'm used to it. I love being out on the road. I love the time to myself. But there's still responsibilities of an employer to ensure that their mental health is not declining as a result of the type of work that they're doing.
Absolutely right.
Well, you know, I think a great place to start really having a deeper conversation about this, Steve, is for us to, as per usual, see one of our wonderful actors in action. And today we're going to meet Maria, who's going to be having a very interesting call. Maria is a FIFO worker, and things aren't all going so well for her. And at the end of it, I'd like to pull it apart a little bit and for us to talk a little bit about the impacts that this work and type of lifestyle is having on her mental well-being.
Ah, Mama. Don't say anything. I know you've already spoken to Rob, huh? Oh, no, Mama, I can't come. No, I can't make it. Look, Mama, I wish I could come to Adelaide. It's my birthday. Of course I want to be with you, but I cannot drive all the way from Carn Hill after the long work day. You know, it's too much. You know, I want to visit you. Of course, I cannot drive from working from 6 a.m. It's a 10-hour drive. Mama, I can't. I know you want me there. I know, I just can't. Work is so intense lately. I've been asked to supervise this new project. I got a crazy deadline to meet. I know, but I am not the supervisor. I'm not the boss. I know what you think I'm in charge. Mama, I already have the weekend 2 weekends ago. No, no one can cover my shift. There's no one. They are already finalized. As it is, Mama, I have a small team. I hardly get to see anyone. They're all scattered around the state. No, most nights I'm the only person here, only ground officer. I mean, can you believe this? It's ridiculous. Mom, I barely get the sleep as it is. No, I start early, I finish late. Oh, Harry. No, Harry quit last week. No, he missed his family and, you know, his friends. He said he's too far away, and now he just leaving me here to suffer. You know, Mama, I feel like I'm losing my hair. Okay? What? No, I don't want to meet the Kenny. Kenny make me less lonely. No, I don't care if he is a nice guy. I have my hands full with the blast hole drill. Yes, he's my relationship. It's like a toxic relationship with the new equipment. Yeah, I know. I start working with the equipment at the same time as everybody else, and yet I'm supposed to magically fix all the issues they have. No, I did not sign up for this. Huh? What did you say? Nah. Pauline and all the higher uppers, they're in their own world. They're far, far, far away from all the chaos I'm dealing with. No, I have had them no training or whatsoever. No, I'm dealing with this all on my own. Sorry. So, oh, Mama, I did not mean to take it out on you. I know you don't know what a blast hole drill is. I just want you to understand my reason for not coming. I'm trying my best. Yeah, I look into the EAP thing, but I'm not holding my breath. Well, the next appointment is a 3-month wait. And even a face-to-face appointment is in Adelaide, a 10-hour drive for a 1-hour appointment. Who is going to do this? Anyway, Mama, I have to get back to it. I'm sorry. Mama, I have to go.
There is so much going on in that incredible phone conversation between mother and daughter. From a mental health perspective, what are you seeing as the risks right now for Maria?
It really was a fantastically delivered role play, very engaging. And I think it's just expressing so many common concerns that, many workers working in remote environments express. Maria is clearly isolated from her family. She's obviously experiencing quite a high level of job demands. She's engaged in high risk work, that blast hole drilling, which I guess just ups the intensity and the challenge of the work. There's been a lack of proper training, which is an element of poor support. She's part of a small team that's scattered geographically, and it doesn't seem like there's any clear systematic process the employers put in place for helping those
Steve,
people. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. And coming back to that, though, this poor training, I just want to ask you whether you believe there's a piece of training around the management of mental health during a time of isolation, especially if that isolation is different. Is that an obligation now really on employers to ensure that people are trained to be able to manage themselves as best as possible when they find themselves in these types of work environments?
Oh, 100%. I mean, as an employer, if I have people working consistently, repeatedly in remote or isolated environments, or indeed working from home, particularly if it's ongoing and extensive, I'm absolutely going to want to be looking at my talent acquisition processes and thinking about, am I selecting people with the initiative, the resilience, and the judgment to function effectively in those environments?
Yeah.
And I'm also going to be training both my leaders and the actual people doing that work to understand common signs and symptoms of stress or mental health challenges so that they can have that "are you okay" conversation and act early if those things are arising.
I think this is an absolutely resounding message for our HR professionals and leaders, that do not make the assumption that people are ready to work in an isolated environment or a remote environment. And that includes whether they're a FIFO, whether they're a salesperson, or whether, in fact, they're working from home. Don't make the assumption that people are ready to do it without some clearer instruction and discussion on how that needs to take place. Sorry, Steve, continue.
No, great. It's a fantastic point. And I'll just add, you're 100% right. And when you look at organizations, at least some of them that have people working in high pressure, remote or isolated environments, some of the scientific evidence points to pre-exposure job previews and that type of stuff. I think they call it stress inoculation, but in English it just means, before I send someone into a remote or isolated environment, I actually talk with them, perhaps both during the selection process, but also prior to the deployment, what it's going to be like, and encourage them to think through, what is my experience of that going to be like, and what type of challenges am I likely to face, and how ready do I feel for those challenges, and maybe even trial people in that remote environment for a few hours or a few days to kind of give them an idea of what the experience will be like. But just to quickly finish on what we heard in Maria's situation, clearly there's been a lack of check-in, a lack of empathy from the leader. She describes the folks in head office not really understanding the challenges on the ground. And then finally, we can just hear that there is some pretty clear work-life balance and stress symptoms here emerging for Maria. She's talking about sleeplessness. Clearly, this is an untenable situation. You can envisage burnout happening reasonably quickly, leading to all its usual consequences of turnover and others. And finally, 3 months wait for an EAP session just sounds like the support resources there haven't been thought through.
And that burnout piece, as you always keep reminding me, is not just about someone's mental well-being, it also then becomes about their physical well-being.
Yeah, 100%. When we're exposed to that burnout, which is really that, chronic unmanaged work stress, it is absolutely, hyperactivating that stress response, the stress hormone cortisol flowing right throughout the body, affecting all the major organs, lots of negative physical impacts like heart disease, etc.
So we've got to get this right, and we've got to get our people ready. The other thing that just stood out to me about Maria's situation also was relative to what you said before, which was that, it was two areas of risk really that were working together to be really problematic for her. That being her workload and also the remote working. So the management of workload, remote working, and therefore leading to really amplifying the potential risk to her well-being. Extremely interesting. So Steve, one of the things you always do for us is provide us a little bit of information about industries that tend to be at a higher level of risk than others. So what is your data showing us about the occupation types?
Yeah, absolutely. So the slides that we're showing you now, which I'll come to in just a second, are data on the proportion of people in different industries, and in the next slide, which we won't go to yet, occupations who are working from home. But just to talk a little bit about remote and isolated work, people working in the outback, for example, or working in the city but in an isolated capacity, such as a service station attendant late at night on shift by themselves. Very hard, at least in a quick way, to find stats on that. But I think just commenting, industries you could imagine with the highest levels of remote work, obviously going to be oil and gas, mining, healthcare, construction, scientific and environmental research, agriculture and fishing, transportation, utility workers, healthcare and emergency services. Moving to talk a little bit about work from home, we're obviously saw in 2023 employers with a strong trend to wind back work from home. And so a survey by Robert Half, I think around October 23, found that in 2023, 87% of Australian employers had implemented mandatory in-office days. Around 1 in 5 employers were saying you've got to be here 5 days a week. About a quarter were 4 days a week is required in the office. Another quarter were 3 days. And the rest were some lesser amount. And Robert Half said that of the employers they surveyed, around 1/3 reported one or more employees resigning in response. Now, again, I'm not expressing a view about whether it's a good or a bad idea. Looking at the slide we have in front of us here, which is showing us the data on working from home split by industry, we can see that, as was the case prior to the pandemic at 2022, when this data is gathered, finance, insurance, information, media, and telecommunication industries all have quite high rates of working from home. And understandably, those industries where you really need some kind of face-to-face contact to deliver the good or service have the lowest rates. So hospitality, food, healthcare, social assistance, retail, arts, recreation, transport, those industries understandably have the lowest levels. I'll ask Mike to switch us now to slide 6 with the next chart. And this chart is just showing us the level of working from home, both pre-COVID and then in 2022 by occupation. And again, unsurprisingly, we've talked a little bit about how the entitlement to work from home has had a slight class or socioeconomic element to it. And that is true because typically, both before the pandemic and in 22, there were more managers and professionals, the group most likely to be working from home. But the big change, I think, occurred with clerical and administrative workers. Occupations that are usually about 3/4 female, and they did have the biggest jump in working from home, from a pre-pandemic rate of 18% up to about 42%, whereas, understandably, machinery operators, drivers, labourers, people who need to be physically there have the lowest levels. Back to you.
And I think it's a time where we're seeing changing attitudes to working from home to an extent where people become disenfranchised from a team. And we do need to remember that it's actually only a certain number of occupations that can allow people to have a choice as to whether they work from home or not. And so So this group, I think, at the moment, are really starting to find what's going to work for the long term. And as you are saying, it appears that what's going to occur is there's going to be a hybrid model. And one of the things that I want employers to be very aware of, if they do it for the longer term, adopt hybrid models, that doesn't mean they have to be any less conscientious about educating people what a day's working from home needs to look like, and to also ensure they have a very strong understanding of the environment in which people are working from home and whether that environment is actually safe. And just because we did it during COVID doesn't mean we stop now and assume that, you know, a new worker who goes into a hybrid model is set up to be able to effectively work from home.
Yeah, 100%. We'll have more to say a bit later about interventions and leadership strategies, but you're absolutely right. In the same way that, you know, we're assessing safety and risks of people in the workplace, we absolutely need to be doing that for people working at home, whether that's hybrid or working remote or working isolated.
So if we're not providing support to people, whatever the type of isolated or remote work that they're doing, if we're not providing them with the right support, what are the potential impacts on physical and mental health?
I rush to emphasize that we are not saying that the mere exposure to remote or isolated work or working from home automatically or necessarily creates these physical or mental health risks. It's not an always occurs type situation. We're talking about potential risks, and you know the requirement on employers is to risk assess these things. So I guess when you think about remote and isolated, well, starting with remote environment, obviously you've got potential exposure to harsh or hostile environments. If you're working in the outback, you might be facing extremes of temperature, weather. You might be exposed to physical risks like snake bite, or, you know, having a car accident or a physical injury without the ability to get any quick medical assistance. Remote workers spending long time driving in vehicles obviously might have some musculoskeletal risks. There you go, I pronounced that word correctly.
Excellent work, Steve.
Yeah, thanks. But obviously from high time in vehicles, confined spaces, working at heights. I guess isolated workers, one of the risks, you know, the psychosocial codes always talk about exposure to violence and aggression. So, you know, again, if you're that late night service station employee, you might have an increased risk of assault from difficult customers or clients. Psychological risks, we saw some of those in Maria, I guess. Higher levels of psychological distress, that came through in the call. Emotional exhaustion. One thing I think is, as I said earlier, people might not be prepared for the physical and professional isolation that they have when they first start working remotely. Also, they might be coping with their own isolation while also needing to support other workers. So, for example, if you're a remote area nurse or any sort of support position in a FIFO type environment, you're coping with your own isolation, but also you've got responsibility to help others. And I guess there's extended periods of separation from family and familiar environments. So, you know, all of the above could exacerbate existing mental health issues. When you're ready, Steve, I just wanted to talk a little bit about this really important issue is, what does the research say about the potential benefits and risks of working from home in terms of well-being and productivity?
Yeah, so why don't we focus on that?
Sure. I think it's an important topic, right? Because the hybrid model and the working from home has massively increased the range and the proportion of people that are now working in an isolated environment. And one thing that's really important to do is to avoid getting confused between the productivity and well-being impacts of working from home per se versus the impacts of COVID. Because obviously in COVID, a lot of people were forced to work from home involuntarily. They didn't have a good home office setup. They might not have been used to working at home. Their family environment, if they're living with someone, which they might not be, it may not have been suitable for working from home. So it's really easy to read all the research that comes out 21, 22 about, oh, gee, all these problems from working from home, and get confused actually with problems with COVID or stress due to COVID. So I've tried to look at studies that are pre and post-COVID, and as you'd expect, some physical risks could be lack of space, poor ergonomics, poor lighting, poor temperature regulation, leading to sort of concerns around musculoskeletal issues. When you talk about psychological benefits and risks of working from home, it's really hard to make an overall comment on its impact, because obviously results are going to differ based on the type of work, the level of support, and the worker's personality. Like some people need more contact with others. But look, the best I can do is to say that the reality is complex. If you pushed me to make a summary comment, I would say overall, the impact on well-being and productivity from working from home seems to be either neutral or slightly positive. And I think the fundamental reason for this is that typically the studies are combining working from home with flexible work arrangements and viewing them as a single package. And you'll remember from our webinar on job control, we saw how important giving employees autonomy and control over work is for their mental and physical health. And obviously, if I'm letting employees have some control over when and where they do their work, I'm boosting that autonomy and that job control. So look, I guess to sum it up, what are the benefits? The research says it might be improved family and work integration, although that's the other side of the work-life conflict coin. There's some evidence of reductions in fatigue and improved productivity. There's some evidence of less role conflict, and those things can all reduce emotional exhaustion. The drawbacks, some people are working extended hours. There is that intrusion of work into home life. There is that lower social support from colleagues and managers. And there's that visibility bias where people in the office tend to get noticed more, and those from working from home might feel overlooked for, promotion or contribution.
And, where it's the organisation's go-to position, I just think about some of the stories I hear again about younger workers, for example, who share a apartment in a share situation with somebody else who is got very different type of style of work life, who may actually be at their premises during the day, when they're supposed to be at work, and all of those kind of things. I think about numbers of parents who have said to me, actually, I want to come to the office. I want to come and work. So there are all of these different factors that need to be influencing the decision that employers make about whether it's the right model, not just for their organisation, but for the individuals involved. And it becomes quite an individual choice, and the organisation needs to work through it with the individuals. And as I said before, not make the assumption that everyone's in a situation or built to work remotely. We've, in our earlier seminar, in seminar 1, we presented the Bell culture model, and it talked about really the importance of leadership in developing cultures. And this would be an area where it was no different from any other cultural matter, which is ultimately that leaders need to be well trained to understand the impacts of remote work, and not, again, for an organisation to just assume that the leader will know best. So, training in this area becomes really important. And, I'm so proud that we're now, we've developed a really up-to-date program that covers all areas of psychosocial risk, and we've got a program specifically for leaders. So how can leaders recognise psychosocial risks, as we've discussed before?
It's a great point. And the content I'm going to summarise here is directly drawn from our, as you mentioned, new program on managing psychosocial risks. Look, I guess when you think about it, there are two basic ways that leaders might become aware of psychosocial risks. Some employees may raise concerns or complaints that expressly reference those risks, right? Like someone might complain, I don't feel like I'm given enough choice or control or autonomy at work. But more often, as was the case with Maria, we might hear employees or see employees exhibiting some signs of these risks without them expressly referencing them or making a complaint. But, you know, as we know, these new psychosocial risks really employers cannot just wait and sit back until someone makes a complaint or raises a concern. They have to be proactive, and leaders can't just delegate the solution of these things to the HR team. Like physical risks, it has to be in everybody cooperating together to solve them. But I think it's really important for leaders to kind of maybe understand some of the signs of stress and psychosocial risks. But obviously, leaders and HR teams are not mental health professionals, and it's important to keep an appropriate boundary between being an HR professional and a leader versus being a counselor or a mental health professional. And we definitely talk in our training both on psychosocial risks and the new course that we've just launched on trauma-informed human resource approaches on how to maintain that boundary. But I think for leaders, the message is understand what the potential signs of psychosocial risks might be in an employee's performance, communication, or engagement. Because when you're focused on how it might affect their work, then having conversations with them about those things is a legally defensible thing. It's part of reasonable management action. It's not prying into an employee's personal life or medical status when there's no reasonable basis to do so. So this slide that we're looking at here really gives us some idea of what are some of the signs, potential signs, that I might, as a leader or an HR practitioner supporting a leader, see in an employee's performance, communication, or engagement if they're experiencing some of these risks. Now, I want to make it really clear, I'm not saying that anyone experiencing these risks will display any or all of these signs. I'm not saying that a person experiencing mental ill health will necessarily experience any or all of these signs, but really these are kind of a bit of a roadmap for leaders around, when would it be a good idea to initiate the supportive conversation? And look, the final thing I'll say on this slide is probably the best guide, because we're all different. We've all got different styles of personality and preferences and needs. So the best guide for a leader is, am I seeing behavior, communication, or performance in this particular member of my team that's different from how they usually are?
Fantastic. So, Steve, what are some of the interventions that we should be expecting employers and leaders to implement to improve support for remote workers? And I've already talked about not making the assumption that everyone is ready to go. So in the context of that, let's talk about some of these interventions.
Interventions really begin with risk assessment. And, in summary, when we're talking about risk assessment, it's around thinking through what are the reasonably foreseeable things that might occur when someone is working in a remote or an isolated or indeed a working from home environment. And we've spoken in our previous webinars about the services that IHR provides around risk assessment. I won't go through those in detail, but just to quickly say that in addition to helping employers deploy scientifically validated psychosocial risk surveys, we know that not all employers have the time, the budget, the capacity, or the survey tolerance to do that. A lot of people are already doing lots of surveys and feel fatigue in that area. It's certainly not the only way that you can measure these risks. And we do work with employers to do things like interviews or focus groups with random selection, or employees in certain teams or divisions where the concern of those risks might be higher. We work with employers to look at their safety metrics and interview their key management and safety teams to try and get an idea of where the risks might be present and what level they're at. But risk assessing remote or isolated work, I guess some of the questions I'd be wanting to ask as an employer are going to be, how often, for how long, and for how severe is an employee's exposure going to be to remote or isolated work? So someone who works consistently 100% of the time in the outback is going to be very different in terms of the support they need to someone who occasionally travels, to a client site. Some of the other questions would be, what time of day is the person working in a remote or isolated environment? Obviously, you might have greater risks on night shift, for example. What communication methods are there for the remote or isolated worker to be communicating back to head office, or to get reasonable supervision? And are those systems going to work in all situations? It's all well and good to have a satellite phone in your car, but if you have to get out of the car and walk 20 meters away to climb a power pole to adjust something and you break your leg, what are you going to do then? Are there high risk activities involved in the remote or isolated work? If yes, then obviously the risk is going to be higher and the support will be greater. Is there an increased risk of violence or aggression if I'm, dealing with customers, clients, or patients, for example, in their home or in public, or if I'm, an employee at the customer service desk of a large warehouse business and I'm out there by myself, and it may be, there's a security door that I have to get through to get support or assistance if some random member of the public tries to assault me. What's the process there for me to get that help? Is there a duress alarm or some barrier that I can hide behind? Those are some of the questions.
And I must say, what comes to my mind is Maria. Thinking about Maria in that environment where she must be feeling extraordinarily vulnerable, especially if a lot of the team are around working around the state.
Look, 100%. And so, talking about the interventions that work for remote and isolated workers, and you've just hit the nail right on the head with one really important one. What am I as the employer doing to facilitate greater connection and support between colleagues and co-workers, particularly if they're remoted, if they're located separately from each other? Am I creating any regular, structured, paid for opportunity for these people to team build and to bond and to share learnings? Is there a regular toolbox talk that's happening where we can talk about safety issues we're all seeing and how to address them? There are definitely ways of doing that with remote communication technology. I guess for high risk jobs, I'm going to want to have a buddy system. I mean, generally, right, because so much of psychosocial intervention is around work design, I'm going to want to try and review the level and times when people are working in a remote and isolated fashion and ask myself, is it necessary? I'm going to want to check my communication systems. We've talked already about training and equipping workers for working alone. Some other things to consider, maybe access to mobile health units or online wellness programs, or just helping employees in remote locations know when and where they can connect with public sector health services and support.
Absolutely.
And finally, just a few things to talk about when it comes to leadership. Scheduling leaders' available hours to ensure that workers on all shifts can participate in leadership meetings and get support. Providing clear management structures and reporting lines so workers know who to ask for help. And I think a really important one, so often when I'm doing cultural psychosocial review work for IHR, I'll be talking to leaders and I'll have people say to me, oh yeah, I've got 40 direct reports. And in my mind, how the heck are you going to make reasonable time to provide each of those reports with support? Now, sometimes in between that leader and those people, there's like a leading hand or a frontline supervisor who does that, but sometimes there isn't. So I think employers really need to think through the span of control and the number of direct reports that leaders have and think about, are they reasonable?
Brilliant idea. I mean, it does start with being strategic about structure. I mean, the resounding message here, and it's like all areas of psychosocial risk, is that employers can't wait for something to happen. They have to be on the front foot. If something happens and they've made no effort to be on the front foot, then it absolutely exposes them to potential litigation. And so we just need to ensure, not let alone the human factor, which is injury to human beings. So we just need to be on the front foot. And I think that's a wonderful point, that even starts with the way we look at structure and supervision and our leadership channels.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, we're hearing now from multiple sources that in at least some of the states in New South Wales, for example, where I'm located, WorkSafe New South Wales is proactively reaching out to employers where there are compensation claims for mental health, and they're not just following up the particulars of the claim, but they're actually sort of saying, hey, show me your documented, systematic, regularly applied psychosocial risk management strategy. So in the case of remote and isolated work, particularly the larger, well-equipped, well-resourced employers that have large remote or isolated workforces are going to be expected to have done the same level of risk assessment and control as an employer operating machinery is expected to have done to make sure that those machines are safe.
We nearly have to finish up here at this conversation and go back to Nicole, but I do need to ask you, because it's always on the mind of our senior executives and HR professionals, to remind us again what the evidence for return on investment is for implementing interventions that actually, for example, ensure the safety and proper support for remote and isolated workers.
Absolutely. And this is such an important point because, as we said in our second webinar, which of course is available online, introduction of psychosocial risk management programs is a massive change management piece. It's not just about the HR or safety team developing a new policy and taking a slightly different approach to things. It really requires everybody in the organization to change, including the leaders, the owners, the board, and the employees, and the safety committee. And the safe work regulators talk about the need for consultation between all those people at all stages of the process. So it's easy, I think, for some people to think that this is just something we have to do because there's a big stick that we're going to be hit with if we don't do it, and there are legal risks. And that's true, there are. But it's really important to keep the carrot in mind. And the carrot really is that as we improve psychosocial risk management, we're creating a mentally healthy workplace. And research clearly shows that interventions that improve mental health do lead to statistically significant increases in well-being, in job satisfaction, in engagement, and ultimately performance and productivity. And a lot of that comes because we're reducing absenteeism, presenteeism, burnout, and emotional exhaustion that can come from these stresses. And I talked about the PwC research back in 2014. If people want to see that, have a look at our second webinar. But in summary, what PwC found was that interventions to boost mentally healthy workplaces were producing in Australian businesses 10 years ago a return of investment of $2.30 for each $1 spent on them. So the evidence is clear, and I think it's really important for HR practitioners and safety practitioners to understand that, because that can help them influence senior stakeholders to get on board with these programs.
Terrific. That's our time. What has really stood out to me today is the whole idea of readiness. Readiness of the individual to work remotely, and readiness of the employer to provide the support that's required. And on that note, Steve, I think we're going to have a month's break, but it's going to be great to come back, and we're going to be talking about another really important topic in this area. So you have a good trip, because I think you're going for a bit of a motorcycle, aren't you?
Going for a bit of a four-wheel drive exploration this time, myself actually into a remote environment where I'll be a very long way away from help or emergency assistance. So I'm going to experience firsthand some of these challenges, although not being paid to do it, but I have the luxury of taking that break. Yeah, I'm looking forward though to coming back and kicking off our next webinar.
You're a good man. All right, let's get back to Nicole, and she's got some questions from the audience.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks for such a wonderful discussion today. There's been so many great key takeaways for the audience, and I've learned a lot. So looking at our questions from the audience, the first one that I have for you is how to find the balance between quality control of service being delivered and support offered to staff when they are on the road in regional areas. What tips do you have to remedy this?
Yeah, it's a really good question, although I think in a way the question sort of implies that you're balancing doing one or the other, and the more you do of one, the less you do of the other. So it's kind of implying that I've either got to put more effort into making sure that my customers or my clients or my service is being delivered in a really good, structured way, or I'm going to put more time on supporting staff. But the research really tells us that the more that you support staff, the better your service quality control is going to be. So I'd actually reframe the question and say, think about the more that I support staff in the ways we've talked about today, the more likely I'm going to have great quality control.
Okay, thank you. The second one, very relevant again to today's workforce. How do we tackle people working from home who undertake carer duties?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd recommend not tackling them because that'd be a physical risk. But seriously speaking, obviously when we've got people with carers' responsibilities working from home, we're kind of balancing, I guess, on the one hand, the need to ensure that they're maintaining reasonable standards of productivity and delivering on the inherent requirements of the job. I'm not suggesting that the mere fact that someone has caring responsibilities puts that at risk, not at all. But for some people, I think if we're being realistic, when we're working from home, we've got caring responsibilities, sometimes they can pull us away from the work. And of course, that's one of the challenges of work from home, right? Because then people feel the need to make up the time, and that's where we get this difficulty of work-life balance. But we're really trying to balance the need for maintaining acceptable standards of productivity against ensuring that we're not discriminating against employees with family or caring responsibilities, because of course the state and federal discrimination laws prohibit that. So I think a couple of things are important. One is, Steve talked about preparation, and I think here it's about the manager and the employee having an honest upfront conversation about how is the work and the caring responsibilities going to combine and be managed in that work from home or hybrid environment. How are we actually going to do that practically? And I think it's important for there to be an honest, ongoing discussion about how it's actually going in reality. The final thing I'll say to avoid indirect discrimination, which in English means that we set a policy or procedure, we expect everyone to comply with it, but it turns out to be harder for certain groups to comply with than others. That's where you've got to be careful with people that have family or caring responsibilities, because as you start to set policies around, everybody's got to work back in the office full time, you might not even mention family or care responsibilities, but it could be harder for that group or other groups to comply with that policy, and that's where you may have a discrimination risk.
Thank you. Another good one we have is, what are some practical tips to maintain wellness in a remote workforce?
Yeah, so I guess one would be to consider an online wellness program. But if you're going to pick one that there's some good scientific evidence to show that it works. There's some great work done for Safe Work New South Wales by Nick Glozier and colleagues from, I think, the Brain and Mind Institute. I think the most recent publication is 2021. There's also a 2017 document, which it involves them reviewing all the scientific literature about which types of wellness interventions work. And I think, if I recall correctly, there's some studies in there about what types of online wellness interventions work. So I would consider having an online wellness intervention. For those working in remote areas, you could consider mobile health clinics. You might be able to set up either yourself if you're a large organization, or through some sort of provider, a clinic that sort of travels around the remote area offering health checks or health services. If you're a smaller organization or you haven't got that capacity, it could just be researching who are the local doctors and allied health professionals in the area and maybe distributing their contact details. And the final point, I guess, is encourage those workers to contact the Employee Assistance Program in a proactive fashion, right? Get that message out that EAP is not just for a mental health crisis, but they can help you with resilience and stress management in a proactive way.
Thanks, Steve. And look, we've got a question that's just come in, which we think is a really good one. We'd love your thoughts on this. What is considered reasonable additional hours?
Well, that's a real hornet's nest, and that's a real bone of contention, I think, for a lot of people, because a lot of people who are on salary arrangements versus awards or enterprise bargaining agreements where they don't actually have an entitlement to be paid for overtime can often feel that they are working a lot of unpaid overtime hours. Now, that phrase, reasonable additional hours, why does the Fair Work Act use that phrase? Because even the Australian government, with the help of all the experts that they use to define that act, could not come up with a definition of what it is in every case. That's why they use that phrase, because it's going to depend on the facts. And so there is no simple, easy answer. I can't say it's X hours and not Y hours. All I can do is to say, it's really about evaluating the nature of the task and the actual work hours of that job and trying to decide on all those factors what is reasonable. I'm sorry, I just can't answer the question.
No, but it was a great answer. So I'd like to thank everybody today for their attendance, and thank Stephen Booker and our Managing Director, Stephen Bell, our wonderful actress who did such a fantastic job of creating a character. And I want to bring to everybody's attention, as mentioned, there will be another webinar in June coming up. But before then, there's lots of things that you can do to keep active with us. I would encourage you to sign up to our newsletter to keep abreast of what's happening here at IHR Australia. And as mentioned, we are running a course on psychosocial risk for managers that will be happening in our public training arena in June. So please keep a lookout for that. Thanks so much for joining us. We hope to see you next time in June. Have a great day.